Hey, Dr. V. This is my video submission for Dropbox 5.2 parts A and B. According to Emerson and Smith, what is a racialized society? A racialized society is one in which a dominant people group in our current society, which would be white, the white power structure, white Americans determine whether tacitly or like actively determine what goes on in that society. So a society being racialized in sociological terms is about where the resources are and who gets access to the resources. Resources being status, wealth, and health, those being the main three. So a racialized society has maybe not overt aspects of racism, like in the Jim Crow South. We like to think that we have grown past those overt racist policies and actions, but it has become subverted into the structures of the society. The structures of the society favor the dominant people group, which is white Americans. In what ways is claiming colorblindness counterproductive? I mean, not only is it counterproductive, it's not even theologically sound. By claiming colorblindness, we don't bear witness. And I think that a lot of the Christian life is about bearing witness, bearing witness to Christ, but also bearing witness to suffering and injustice. So if we say colorblindness, then we are completely obfuscating the core issues at play with the racial divide in our country and the racial issues in our country. So it's mostly white Americans who want to say we should reach a place where we're all colorblind. But racism isn't about color. Racism is the color being a jumping off point for oppression by the dominant people group. But racism and racialism, a racialized society, is about locked in perspectives, structural inequality, and behavior. In your opinion, why does talking about race or ethnicity often become difficult and volatile? Why is it difficult or not for you to talk about race and ethnicity personally? Well, for me, it's not personally. It is not difficult for me to talk about race and ethnicity, but I think in general it's difficult to talk about because there's a lot of shame involved, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance with white Americans with that shame. I guess it's kind of been tagged as white fragility. I'm not really quite sure about that though. But there's a cognitive dissonance that occurs with the stable state of most white Americans have a certain amount of stability in their cultural role and in their cultural place. And talking about race and ethnicity destabilizes and being open to vulnerability and their own vulnerability and to the hurt and pain of other people. And there's that whole thing, like in that movie that we watched, the DeWolf family, that whole thing about, well, it wasn't my relatives. This was 100 years back, but not really recognizing that those policies and that trading of human flesh built a foundation in this country upon which all these other structures were built. So that is 5.2, and here's 5.2 part B, racialized society. This goes into those two really good movies. In Traces of the Trade, what role did racialization play in the creation and maintenance of industry and commerce in Bristol, Rhode Island? Well, the family that trace their roots back, that have that ancestral grounding in Bristol, Rhode Island, through the DeWolf family and the dynasty that was created through the slave trade and through other economic concerns that were informed and supported by the trading of slaves. Obviously, it built the fundamental structure, economic structure of that area. Um, so it played a huge role to creating and maintaining it. To what extent do you believe the advantages and disadvantages caused by racialization may still be in effect in Bristol, Rhode Island today? And, in my opinion, I don't think that that movie really talked too much about that. Maybe they did by proxy in talking about the legacy of the slave trade and within that family, the following generations of that family. I mean, they did show that one part where that one mill that the James DeWolf founded is still active and owned by a Dutch company. So it's still, that structure is still active and that business is still active. But that's really the only fact that they directly talked about on Bristol. But they did talk about the legacy in the family, and then followed the family in their journey through this self-discovery about their own roots, and then traveling to Ghana and then traveling to Cuba to sort of walk in the footsteps or experience in real time what the slaves that their family was a part of taking from their homeland and bringing here as slaves. So I felt like it was more about that. And I think that you see within that case study of that family a huge effect of racialism, even from when they started in their early interviews and then when they progressed to the end and they had those three family members who were very active in, trying to, through the Episcopal Church, it seemed, trying to find a place and a definition for reconciliation. And I think a lot of theologians are working on that same idea. Christian theologians are working on what does reconciliation look like, and repair for that. Let's see, I'm sorry. In this video, what issues held significant meaning, race questions, or stirred strong emotion in you? I don't know if it, I think that when they were down in that cellar at the mansion, that was pretty affecting. And it wasn't that there was like 1,000 people crammed into those rooms. It was just the contrast of the living quarters for the governor and his family, and then the slaves down below, and the stark contrast of that, and how that really does mirror the darkness that a lot of ancestors of those slaves still live in, due to our just the huge disparity of distribution of wealth and opportunity in this country. And I kind of have a interesting look at that personally, because I'm on the very low end of the economic spectrum, and my ex-husband's on the very high end of the economic spectrum. So I kind of see that play out daily. Now, I am actually Latino. My family's half Cuban, and where my mom's side of the family is old Welsh family. But I, am white and enjoy the privilege of not having to think about my race when I go about my daily living. That goes back to the first question that we addressed with Emerson and Smith, that a racialized society is one where some of the people don't have to think about their race, and some of the people cannot avoid thinking about their race, which would be African Americans. And that's just, that skin color goes way out before African Americans, and white people don't even really think about it. What raised that? So that starts with strong emotion and held significant meaning. And what questions were raised? What questions were raised for me was the actions that these three family members, like the girl that did the movie, and her three family members, as they were to kind of understand themselves more fully. And when that movie was closing, I was thinking about, kind of tracking along with the narration. And she said, what if, right at the end of the movie, she said, what if we're here now? Like, what if we are here now, just waiting to come together and waiting to find each other? And that really brought to my mind the scripture of, the kingdom of heaven doesn't come with your careful observation it is now. Because I think we can get really, really lost in the particulars of how to mend a very divided society. And I thought that was very thought provoking when she said that last part. Provide a conclusion that summarizes your thoughts and describes how the content from Emerson and Smith in these two videos will affect the ways you conduct ministry in the future. Those who choose to submit this out, okay. I'm doing the video submission, so this is a really tough question for me because I am not going into congregational ministry or into the mission field proper. So these questions, I can tell you there are many takeaways to take with me, like in improving your cultural intelligence. And Emerson and Smith, I thought it was a great study and brought up some really great points about the white evangelical church being somewhat market-driven. And like even with church planning, you see it like there's a big church and they get a bunch of money together and then they go plan a church somewhere like downtown Indianapolis, but they still tend to bring white people into the church because of the worship style, because the cultural context of that church goes into that church plan. So it's kind of a market-driven model. But I'm not a part of the white evangelical church. So, but I really appreciated their observations on all that and how the white evangelical church in its, and within Protestantism in general, that very, very strong stress on free will, autonomy, relationship, and responsibility can really ignore larger communal social structures and not give them, because that's where the problems are. Like we can go and have dinner with our African American neighbor, or I have 3 African American friends at work and we go out to lunch or whatever that looks like. That does not address the deep social structures that are ill. So this is a really hard question for me to answer. Besides summarizing, the content from Emerson Smith in the 2 videos, I thought I missed one. I'm sorry. The difference between, I thought this was in here when I looked over it before. The difference between us, race, and the power of illusion. To what extent do you think the illusion of race contributes to the creation or perpetuation of perceptions that lead to racialization? I think that movie was right on, and I don't know that much about sciencey stuff. But I do know that, like genetically and biologically, we're all much more similar than we are different. But I think that because race is, like the color of someone's skin is the first thing that you see, that it has become that we attribute traits to that. And in that way, the illusion of race contributes greatly to the perpetuations and perpetuates perceptions that lead to racialization. To what extent has the illusion of race influenced your thinking about people whose ethnicity is different than your ethnicity? I can honestly tell you it has not really affected me very much personally. In this video, it issues held significant meaning, raised questions, or stirred strong emotions. Well, I just thought it was like really interesting when they were working, when the students were working in the lab, and that one kid, the white kid, was so very sure that his DNA markers would lead him like to the Balkans, and they did, but then they also led him to Iceland, and they also led him to Africa. And I really think that kid had a little bit of a paradigm shift in there. And there was that one gentleman, I think he was one of the evolutionary biologists, talked about paradigm shifting. And that it's like when he made the analogy of when people thought the earth was flat, then you go up high enough on the mountain, you can see the curve. And I believe that, education can only go so far with people because these racialization's really, really embedded in our culture. But those are really interesting points. And then the conclusion part. So how will it affect the way that I conduct ministry in the future? I don't know a very good answer to that question because my ministry context is working with people from all different religions, all different races, in the end of life process. So, and my own feelings on the role of chaplaincy and what a chaplain does. So I think I already come to ministry with a pretty healthy concept of working with others across cultural and racial lines. Because when people are dying, I mean, with some cultures there are death rituals and burial rituals and those kind of things, and that's a matter of educating oneself on how that family and how that individual perceives the dying process. But it's just that this question doesn't really apply to my ministry context, I think is where I'm heading. So those are my video submissions, and I will see you later. Thank you so much. This has been a really interesting class. I really did enjoy the content for this workshop.